The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from listeners like you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and generous contributions from listeners like you.
It's a great pleasure tonight for me to introduce Lester Brown. He holds degrees in agriculture, economics, and public administration, and dozens, perhaps, honorary degrees, or degrees squared, as he just mentioned. He served in the government as agricultural policy advisor until 1974 when he started the World Watch Institute. And Lester has been the director of the Earth Policy Institute now since 2001. Lester Brown has a food and land-based view of our global crisis, linking climate, water, food, poverty, and political stability together in ways we and also policy folks can understand. What is more impressive, at least to me, is that his knowledge of sustainable land use has roots on a New Jersey tomato farm. I realized this as a sign of high quality when customers on my family farm said, "These tomatoes are as good as those we used to get in New Jersey." So Lester Brown, along with Wes Jacks and Amory Lovins, were household names in my family growing up. My mother and aunt recently told me they looked forward to the World Watch State of the World reports every year that my grandmother received. So Lester's been preaching the gospel of sustainability since this first wave, which after a generational aftershock is now unfolding into a tidal wave. I should also mention Lester Brown is a marathon runner. He runs 26 miles in a few hours, but he also keeps up a marathon travel and speaking schedule. And I'm sure that he offsets his flights, but that truly depends on whether we take his message to heart and act quickly. So he's written several books, Plan B 4.0, which you'll hear about tonight, but mostly Lester Brown, I think, is pioneering his publishing in multimedia, open source, and in real time. You may have even heard parts of the talk already or seen some of the slides if you have subscribed. The earthpolicy.org posts public slides, videos, podcasts, book bite, emails, conference calls, executive summaries, and web updates regularly. Every way to get the message out, and the message is catching on. Plan B 1.0 came out 2003, 2.0 in 2005, as rescuing a planet under stress and a civilization in trouble. So the updates continue. 3.0, which I read last year, came out, and Tom Friedman's book came out. Now 4.0 and Al Gore, there's really a wave of views on how to solve global problems with scalable local solutions. So listen carefully for answers to a few questions that I hope Lester will address tonight. So, spatial scale. What is the appropriate sustainable scale? Do we just trade everywhere with whoever has the comparative advantage? Should we all live plugged into a national mega wind, solar, and geothermal grid? Should we all slim down and contribute distributed resources from rooftop solar, micropower, small gardens? And what about time? How do we consider that CO2 once released will cause warming for centuries, while the costs of action or the short-term savings of inaction show up on quarterly reports? How do we properly value the future? I imagine it's in the same way that we value soil fertility on our family farms. So the message, how do we motivate our friends on the urgency of these interconnected issues? It's too complicated, too complex, overwhelming, depressing to think about. It's enough. Or the other message is greenwashing. I drive a Prius, I change my light bulbs, I recycle, I've done my part, and I've saved money. So what's the worries? So my last question, Lester, is I'm looking forward to Plan A 5.0. When will business as usual be the right path? recently, I believe Lester Brown and even Al Gore sound more optimistic. Are we near a tipping point? When the alternative becomes the mainstream? Please join me in welcoming Lester Brown.
Thanks, Justin. Earlier this evening, I asked Jamie if she would help me to remember my umbrella. And in the process of doing that, she forgot to mention that we're on C-SPAN Book TV tonight, which means you have to be on your best behavior. Some time ago, in fact, many years ago now, Justin, I was being introduced by the late Senator Paul Simon of Illinois, a longtime friend. And he was holding up the latest book I'd written, and he said, Lester's written the sort of book that once you put it down, you can't pick it up again. If you don't get a chance to read the book, there will be a movie. There is a 2-hour special now in production on Plan B. When I mentioned to one of our funders that I was going on a book tour, this was in June of last year, to promote several of the early translations of Plan B 3.0. And I mentioned I would be in Japan. We'd be launching the Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Hindi, Turkish, and Italian editions on this particular swing. And she said, oh, wouldn't it be great to get that on film? So we mentioned it to our production team who's producing for PBS, Hal and Marilyn Weiner. They do the Journey to Planet Earth series. It's been on TV now for several years. They do 1 or 2 hours a year. And they thought it would be a good idea. And so our funder came up with the funding so they could go with me. But what they didn't realize is they were going to hear the same Plan B talk 23 times. And after a bit, about a week, Hal said, he said, I've got this talk down now. He said, I think I can do it pretty well. And I had to tell him about a physicist who worked for the European Space Agency, who was on tour sort of drumming up support for the European space program. And he was being driven from town to city and so forth around Europe on this tour. And his chauffeur came up with the same response. After a week or so, he said, I can give this talk. And the physicist just sort of laughed. And so he kept bringing it up. Finally, the physicist said, well, next Tuesday night, we're going to be in a small town. He said, but I'm concerned about the Q&A session, if you do it. And the chauffeur said, well, what I've learned is they almost always ask the same questions. So he said, that won't be a problem. So the physicist said, okay, next Tuesday night, we're going to change uniforms. He said, you put on my jacket and tie, and I'll put on your chauffeur's uniform. So the chauffeur got up there, and he was really, he was excited about it, and he really gave a good talk. And then he was doing the Q&A, and he was doing very well. Until another physicist in the group stood up and asked one of these very technical questions, if this and that and this, and so forth, and how would this affect that? And the guy listened and he said, that sounds like a complicated question. He said, but it's actually pretty simple. I'll bet my chauffeur could answer that. Well, so I told Hal that he'd better be sure and have his chauffeur with him. One more Washington story, then I'll try to get serious. This one goes back to 1990 or so when Gorbachev was visiting Washington for the first time. And some of you may remember détente was in full bloom then, and U.S.-Soviet relations were improving dramatically. And when his entourage was driving down K Street, he actually had them stop. And he got out and walked down the sidewalk shaking hands with everyone. It was really quite a spontaneous sort of thing on his part, because he was just so excited by being in the United States and able to meet with people on the street. So then he reciprocated the invitation, and President Bush went to Moscow. And late one afternoon, after they'd finished their formal meetings, they were just sitting around with their feet up and an interpreter, and they were talking about the problems of governing. And Bush said, for me, one of the difficult things is getting the right person in the right position in the cabinet. He said, that's really challenging. And he said, how do you go about doing that? And Gorbachev said, well, I have a list of questions that I ask the candidates, and I evaluate their abilities based on their response. And Bush said, well, like what sort of questions? And he said, well, when I was interviewing Shevardnadze for foreign minister, I asked them the question, who is your father's son who's not your brother? And Bush said, and what did he say? And Gorbachev said, Shevardnadze said, that's me. So Bush thought about this for a bit. And he got back to Washington. And he called in Dan Quayle. And he said, Danny said, I've got a question for you. Yes, Mr. President? He said, Danny, who's your father's son who's not your brother? Let me get back to you on that, Mr. President. So out he went, and a day or two went by, and he was thinking, who is your father's son who's not your brother? And then he was walking down the hall past Henry Kissinger's office. He said, aha, Henry knows everything. So he knocked on the door. He said, Henry, I've got a question for you. Yes? Who's your father's son who's not your brother? Kissinger said, that's me. Really? Sure. Down the hall he goes to the president. He said, Mr. President, you know that question you asked me, who's your father's son who's not your brother? It's Kissinger. Sometime later, Bush was calling Gorbachev about something. And he said, you know that question you asked Shevardnadze, who's your father's son who's not your brother? He said, I asked Dan Quayle that. And you know what he said? He said it was Henry Kissinger. And I said, no, it's Shevardnadze. From time to time, I'm going to get serious now. From time to time, I go back and read the literature, particularly if there are any new articles, journal articles, or what have you, on early civilizations and their decline and collapse, the ones whose archaeological sites we study today. And what I've come to realize is that more often than not, the reason for the decline of early civilizations was a decline in their food supply. With the Sumerians, it was the rising salt level in the soil, based on a fault in the design of what was otherwise an exceptional irrigation system. For the Mayans, it was deforestation and soil erosion, quite possibly exacerbated by prolonged drought. And so whether it's them or the Easter Islanders or the Norse settlement that Jared Diamond writes about on Greenland, it was the food supply that brought them down. And I've long rejected the idea that food could be the weak link in our modern civilization. But as I've thought about it over the last couple of years or so, I've come to realize that the environmental trends that are undermining the world food economy that we've been tracking now for decades are trends that we have not been able to reverse, whether it's soil erosion, aquifer depletion, collapsing fisheries, deforestation, grassland deterioration. These trends have been going on now for some time, and we've not turned a single one of them around. And you do not have to be an ecologist to see that if these continue, that eventually we'll be in serious trouble. There used to be one source of additional demand for food. That was population growth from the beginning of agriculture up until today. We're now adding 79 million people here. That continues to be a major source of additional demand. A second source of additional demand is much more recent, mostly post-World War II, and that is people rising up the food chain, consuming more and more grain-intensive livestock products. That's now become a major source. We estimate there are probably close to 3 billion people in the world today trying to move up the food chain. And then the third factor, the third source of additional demand for food, is the conversion of grain into fuel for cars. This year, we will harvest in this country just over 400 million tons of grain. Of that, 100 million tons will be going to ethanol distilleries to produce fuel for cars. So it's no wonder now, with three sources of growing demand for food in the world, that we're seeing these extraordinary price rises. From the beginning of 2007 till late spring 2008, we saw a rise in wheat, rice, and corn prices, roughly a tripling, also soybean prices. And it took the worst economic meltdown since the Great Depression to curb that rise and begin to bring grain prices down. They're still not anywhere near back to normal, but at least they're not at the level they were. So we're facing real challenges on the demand side now. And then on the supply side, I'm not going to talk about all the trends, but I want to talk for a minute about water. We drink about 4 liters of water a day, as water or pop or juice or coffee or whatever, about 4 liters of water a day. The food we consume requires about 2,000 liters a day, or 500 times as much. Food production is extraordinarily water intensive. I remember writing an article a few years ago in which I used these numbers and pointed out that we, in effect, eat 2,000 liters of water a day. And the editor circled this in the margin and said, "Don't you mean 2,000 liters a year?" And that's not surprising, because it's not clear that we actually eat so much water. It takes a lot of water to produce food. And what we're looking at now is a world where water tables are falling in countries containing half the world's people. And that includes the big 3 grain producers, China, India, and the United States. One of the most dramatic water stories that's unfolding in the world is in Saudi Arabia. After the Arab oil export embargo in the 1970s, the Saudis realized they would be vulnerable to a counter grain export embargo because they were importing much of their grain. So they began trying to figure out what to do. And using their oil drilling technology, they found a fossil aquifer about a half-mile down. A fossil aquifer is an aquifer that does not naturally recharge. So they started pumping it, and they had a support price for wheat about 4 times the world market level, which you can do when you have a lot of oil money. And for more than 20 years, they've been self-sufficient in wheat production. But last year, they announced that that aquifer was largely depleted, and they would be reducing their grain harvest by 1/8 each year until by 2016, they would be out of the grain production business entirely and dependent on imports to feed what will then be a Canada-sized population of 30 million people. Now, what's interesting about this is not so much the effect on the world grain balance, because the Saudi wheat harvest was under 0.5% of the world harvest. But what it does show us is what happens when countries deplete aquifers. Yemen, which borders Saudi Arabia, and has been much in the news in recent days because of that troubled border area, is also losing its irrigation water supply. The Yemeni aquifer is replenishable, but they're pumping it at 4 times the rate of recharge. So they're going to lose most of their irrigation water within a matter of years. But what really makes a difference is the big countries. A World Bank study of India points out, this is a 2005 study, points out that 15% of India's people are being fed from grain produced by overpumping. That's 175 million people. We've done a comparable estimate for China. It's about 130 million people being fed by overpumping. And you can go through a list of other countries, Pakistan, Iran, Mexico, that are also overpumping. But one of these days, I mean, the thing that's so disturbing about this is that water tables are falling in so many countries at the same time. Countries in the Middle East that import, that are pushing against the limits of their water supply, North Africa and throughout the Middle East, all the way to and including Iran. When they need more water for cities, they usually take it from the irrigation water supply. Then they import grain to offset the loss of productive capacity. The reason for this is that since it takes 1,000 tons of water to produce 1 ton of grain, the most efficient way to import water is in the form of grain. Grain becomes the currency with which countries balance their water books. And the world grain market is, in a sense, a world water market. To the extent that we have a world water market, it is embodied in the grain market. Countries with water surpluses can export. Countries with water deficits import grain. So the water issue is a big one, and because it's underground, you can't photograph it. It's largely out of sight, but that doesn't make it any less real. And then we have some new trends beyond soil erosion, aquifer depletion, and so forth, and that is ice melting. I did a piece, we call them Plan B updates that Justin referred to, entitled The Copenhagen Conference on Food Security. And I did that piece because this is sort of the bottom line at Copenhagen. I mean, the 193 delegations that are planning to gather have various concerns on the climate front. For countries in East Asia and the Caribbean, it's more powerful and more destructive storms. For Southern Europe, East Africa, Australia, it's intense heat and drought and lower crop yields. For the low-lying island countries, it is rising sea level. I was at a UN conference on population and development in Addis Ababa a few weeks ago, and I was pointing out to the 113 or so delegations who were there, national delegations, that we're almost certainly going to see a decline in UN membership. And they said, why? And I said, because there's so many low-lying island countries that may not exist 30 years from now, simply because of rising sea levels. Some of them are so close it doesn't take much of a rise for them to begin planning evacuations, and some of them are already at that stage. The ice sheets are melting, the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet. If the Greenland ice sheet melts entirely, sea level rises 23 feet. West Antarctica breaks up completely, and it's already started to break up. Sea level rises 16 feet. So we're looking at potentially very substantial rises in sea level over the longer term. The Greenland ice sheet will not melt overnight. It could take a couple of centuries. The latest projections are that during this century, we can now expect roughly a rise in sea level up to 6 feet. But even a 3-foot rise in sea level, according to a World Bank map, would put half the rice land in Bangladesh underwater. Bangladesh is a country of 160 million people, roughly the half that of the United States. A 3-foot rise in sea level would put a good part of the Mekong Delta beneath the sea. The Mekong Delta produces half the rice for Vietnam, a country of 80 million people, and a country that is the world's second-ranking rice exporter after Thailand. But in addition to Bangladesh and Vietnam, there are another 18 or 20 rice-growing river deltas in Asia, all of which will be affected in varying degrees by rising sea level. Imagine ice melting in the far North Atlantic will shrink the rice harvest of Asia. But this is not the most serious threat. That's coming from melting mountain glaciers. The World Glacier Monitoring Institute in Switzerland has now reported the 18th consecutive year of shrinking mountain glaciers around the world. They monitor glaciers in the Andes and the Rocky Mountains, the Alps, the Himalayas, on the Tibetan Plateau. And what they're reporting is that glaciers are shrinking everywhere. It is the ice melt from the glaciers in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau that sustains the major rivers of Asia during the dry season. The Indus, the Ganges, the Yangtze, the Yellow. And it is that ice melt that sustains the rivers that also sustains the irrigation systems of India and China, for example. China is the world's leading wheat producer. India is number 2. We are number 3. A lot of people think we're number 1. We're not. China's wheat harvest is nearly double that of ours, and it is because they irrigate most of their wheat, whereas we irrigate very little of our wheat. With rice, China and India totally dominate the world rice harvest. So what happens to the glaciers in the Himalayas on the Tibetan Plateau will have the most massive effect on future food security of anything we've ever seen. We've never had a projected threat to food security on this scale before. Now, to many Americans, thinking about the melting glaciers on the Tibetan Plateau, that's China's problem. It is China's problem, but it's also our problem, because if China comes into the world market for massive quantities of grain, as it has done over the last decade for massive quantities of soybeans, it will come to the United States because we are far and away the world's largest grain exporter. For American consumers, us, this is a nightmare scenario because we're looking at the prospect of competing with 1.3 billion Chinese with rapidly rising incomes for our grain harvest. Now, historically, when we faced a situation like that and food prices were rising out of control, we restricted exports, as in the 1970s, for example. The problem today is that China is our banker. Every month, the Treasury Department auctions off Treasury securities. This is how we cover our fiscal deficit. And one of the big buyers every month, some month the biggest buyer, is China. They now hold over $1 trillion of U.S. Treasury securities. $1 trillion. That's 1,000 billion. Like it or not, we're going to be sharing our grain harvest with the Chinese. Big time. The world is changing. It's changing so fast, I don't think that most of us who don't have the luxury, as I do, of tracking these things all the time, realize how much. We also have rising temperatures affecting grain harvests. The rule of thumb that has emerged among crop ecologists, and this is included in a paper published by the National Academy of Sciences, is that for each 1 degree Celsius, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit rise in temperature above the norm during the growing season, we can expect a 10% decline in wheat, rice, and corn yields. So the problem is that agriculture as it exists today has evolved to maximize production in a climatic regime that has changed very little over the last 11,000 years, until quite recently. Now, as it changes, the agriculture will be increasingly out of sync with the climate system. And the effect of higher temperatures on yields are one manifestation of that. One of the consequences of these trends is that it is not only leading to higher food prices, it's leading to an increasing number of hungry people in the world. For some decades during the last century, the number of hungry people in the world was declining until the late 1990s, and then it bottomed out at about 825 million. It then turned upward. Last year, it went over 900 million. This year, it has gone over 1 billion. And the prospects are that it's going to continue rising. And one of the consequences of these this continuing rise in the number of hungry people is growing political instability in low-income countries around the world. And one of the effects of this is to increase the number of failing states. When I lived in villages in India in 1956, India was only 9 years old. It was created, one of the many, many countries created as a result of decolonization during the couple of decades after World War II. This was a period of nation building, creating new states, colonies becoming independent countries. And now suddenly in the past decade, we have this new term creeping into our vocabulary of failing states. A failed state is a state that can't provide personal security. Pakistan would be an example. There are many others. A failing state cannot feed its people. Haiti would be a dramatic example of this. But states are failing, and the list is growing longer year by year. And it raises a disturbing question, which is how many failing states before our global civilization begins to unravel? Yesterday I was in Minneapolis. I took 3 cabs while I was there. All 3 drivers were Somalis. And I couldn't help but contrast them driving cabs and moving us about, and their cousins still in Somalia trying to make a living by escorting ships into the harbor in Somalia and holding them ransom. I mean, what a division. These guys were very nice, good cab drivers. But there are now 20 navies with a presence in the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf area, trying to protect ships going through the area, and often failing. Piracy has become a major source of income for a lot of people in Somalia. I say Somalia, it's a failed state. It doesn't really exist as a country. It does on the map, but not in reality. There's no government there to negotiate with about hostages, for example. This is a free enterprise system, if you will. Just a year ago, I was reading an article in Newsweek magazine on climate and energy. It was a long feature article, 3 or 4 pages. But at the end of the first paragraph, there was a sentence that sort of jumped off the page. It said, "Business as usual is beginning to read like the end of the world." And it struck me not because it was a new revelation for me, but because it was a mainstream news magazine saying this. Business as usual is no longer an option for us, no longer a viable option. And we've got to change quickly. And we call the key changes needed Plan B. Plan B has 4 components: stabilizing climate, stabilizing population, eradicating poverty, and restoring the economy's natural support system, soils and forests and grasslands and fisheries, aquifers, and so forth. We don't really have any choice if we want to sustain civilization. I was in a meeting in Raleigh, North Carolina, and someone earlier today, maybe someone here, I can't remember for sure, was at that meeting. It was called something like the American Society of Higher Educators for Sustainability, or for Sustainable Development. I can't remember exactly, but that was the thrust of it. And I thought about the term for sustainability is what it was. And as one of those who was involved 30, nearly 40 years ago now in sort of conceptualizing sustainable development as an ecological concept, it occurred to me that it's not a very exciting term. It does not, quote, stir men's souls, end quote. And as I was talking, it occurred to me, and this was a huge group of 1,600 professors who teach courses in sustainable development, or the individuals on campuses across the country responsible for the greening of the campus. So it was a huge group with so many U.S. colleges and universities represented. And I said, you know, we ought to stop talking about sustainable development and talking about saving civilization. This is what it's all about. And I could see students rallying to a call, to work to sustain civilization. But to achieve sustainability, it just doesn't work very well. So I think we've got to rethink that. But the exciting thing is that we can now begin to see how to build a new economy, one that will be sustainable. We can now see, if you will, how to save civilization. Let me just talk about lighting for a minute. Most of us here know that if we go from an incandescent light bulb to a compact fluorescent, we can reduce electricity use 75%. But if we go from an incandescent to an LED, a light-emitting diode, the latest lighting technology, and a more costly one, and if we combine that with smart sensors so that lights go off when there's no one in the room, then we can cut electricity use by 90%. That would enable us to close 705 of the world's 2,300 coal-fired power plants. Just that one initiative, entirely doable. In Los Angeles, I was in California just a few days ago, but in Los Angeles, the mayor is now in the process of replacing the 130,000 streetlights in the city with new highly efficient light-emitting diodes. They cost quite a bit more, and it'll take them 8 years to cover that additional cost. Take the electricity savings in 8 years to cover that cost. Then they'll be home free. And each year, the electricity bill will be $11 million less than it would have been if they had not made the change. And then there's an enormous savings on the maintenance side, because these LEDs last a long time. Some of the manufacturers are pointing out that if you put in an LED when your child is born, that will still be working when the youngster goes off to college. I mean, it's an exciting new technology. I could talk about other gains in efficiency, but that makes the point. The other thing that's happening that's so exciting is that the rate and the scale of the growth in renewable energy development is just anything beyond we could have imagined 2 years ago when we were finishing Plan B 3.0. It's just extraordinary. Consider the state of Texas. Texas now has 8,000 megawatts of wind generating capacity. They have another couple thousand under construction, and according to an energy research firm that's looked at this in detail, some tens of thousands more in development. Altogether, they add up to, according to this research report, 53,000 megawatts of wind generating capacity. Think 53 coal-fired power plants. When these wind farms are finished, they will generate more electricity than the 24 million people living in Texas can consume. It's just extraordinary. What I find so interesting about this is that if you were to rank states in the U.S. according to environmental sensitivity, Texas would not be near the top. This is oil country. And a lot of oil guys are investing in wind farms because they see that's where the future is, and that's where the money is. China. China has come to wind energy late, partly because they insisted on having, I think it was 70% local content in the wind turbines. And it took a while to get that because they hadn't been involved in developing wind technologies in the wind industry. But this will be the 5th year in which they have doubled their generating capacity, their wind generating capacity. And you don't have to be a mathematician to know if you keep doubling every year, eventually you're going to have a lot. In addition to this ongoing, a government agency, I think it's called the National Resources Development Commission. It's pretty close. I don't think I have it exactly right. But it is coordinating the development of 6 wind mega complexes in China, the smallest of which will have 10,000 megawatts of generating capacity, the largest of which will have 30,000 megawatts of wind generating capacity. Altogether, it comes to well over 100,000 megawatts. Again, think 100 coal-fired power plants. And this is on top of all the wind farms already being built on a much smaller scale. The Chinese are worried. They're worried about pollution. It's taking an enormous toll on their population, and birth defects, cancer rates. The leading source of death in China today is cancer. Usually in low-income countries, it's infectious diseases, and then they transition into cardiovascular diseases, which is where we are. But China has carved out a separate area where cancer has become the leading source of death. A third project, and this is the biggest of all. For years now, I've heard from the Club of Rome about a project to harness the solar energy resources of North Africa to generate electricity for Europe. I don't know how many years I've been hearing this, and it always seemed like a good idea, but it never seemed to get much traction. I heard it twice last year, once at a conference in June in Rome, and then in early September, another conference in northern Germany. But on July 13th of this year, Munich Reinsurance, probably the world's largest reinsurer. A reinsurer is a company that insures the operating insurance companies to spread the risk. Munich Re has put together a consortium of a dozen corporations, European corporations, one from Algeria. And it includes Deutsche Bank, Siemens, ABB, E.ON, several other major companies. And they have created a new organization, the purpose of which is to devise a strategy to integrate the solar resources of North Africa into the European electricity system, combining it with wind from Northern Europe and the North Sea, for example, to satisfy their future electricity needs. The second responsibility of this new organization is to develop a financial plan to do this. And they announced just 2 weeks ago that they expect to be pumping electricity under the Mediterranean via oceanic cable to Europe from solar thermal power plants in North Africa by 2015. A German research firm has looked at this. Well, first let me point out that the Algerians, which have already started building solar thermal power plants to export electricity because they know one day they won't be exporting oil, they point out that in their desert they have enough harnessable solar energy to power the world economy. That sounds like an error, but it's not. I should also point out that in China, just a few months ago, a U.S.-China team completed a national wind resource inventory. They pointed out in an article in Science that China has enough harnessable wind energy to increase its current electricity consumption 7-fold. That's just wind. Doesn't include solar, doesn't include geothermal. The point is, and in this country, we've known now for a long time that North Dakota, Kansas, and Texas have enough harnessable wind energy to easily satisfy national energy needs, electricity, and all other energy needs as well. One of the questions that comes up when we think about, I should also mention that in setting the goals for cutting carbon emissions in Plan B, we did not ask the question that political leaders usually ask, which is what's politically feasible or acceptable or popular among my constituents. Because when you ask that question, they all say the same thing, basically. We want to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2050. That's a convenient date because very few of them will be in office then. But we didn't start with the politics at the Earth Policy Institute. We started with the science, and we asked the question, how much and how fast do we have to cut carbon emissions if we want to have at least a decent shot at saving the Greenland ice sheet? How fast do we have to close coal-fired power plants if we want to save at least the larger glaciers in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau? And when you ask that question, it's clear we have to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2020. For those of you who track the science, atmospheric CO2 is now about 387 parts per million. If we cut carbon emissions 80% between now and 2020, we'll hold the line at just under 400 parts per million. Then the stage will be set after 2020 for reducing atmospheric CO2 to the 350 parts per million that Jim Hansen, probably the U.S. government's leading climate scientist, and Rajendra Pachauri, the head of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, think we need to be pushing for. And they think we need to get to 350 parts per million as quickly as possible. So we look at the U.S. and gasoline consumption. We consume in this country more gasoline than the next 20 countries combined. That includes Japan, China, Russia, Germany, Brazil, and 15 other countries. We consume a lot of gasoline. The good news is that oil use in this country, and probably gasoline use as well, has dropped about 10% in the last 2 years. But the key to reducing our gasoline consumption is electrifying our transport system. And with cars, that means moving to plug-in hybrids and all-electric cars. And it's entirely doable. I mean, GM has pointed out that the Chevrolet Volt, using EPA standards for determining mileage, will get 230 miles per gallon of gasoline used. And that's because most of the time it will be running on electricity, because it'll have a range, I've forgotten, of 40 or 60 miles, so that most daily driving can be done with electricity and the recharge of the battery at night. Prius, Toyota will have several hundred Prius plug-in hybrids in various commercial fleets and so forth in this country by the end of next month. And then next year, it'll probably begin marketing on a larger scale. BYD, a Chinese firm, started marketing plug-in hybrids in China last December. They plan to be in this market next year. Warren Buffett is one of the stockholders in this company. So we're looking at enormous potential for reducing gasoline use by moving to plug-in hybrids and all-electric cars. Engineers know, but not everyone else knows, that an electric motor is 3 times as efficient as a gasoline engine. So moving to electric motors really harnesses a lot of efficiency. It also means we can be running cars on the electricity equivalent of a gallon of gasoline that'll cost about 75 cents. And especially if it's wind energy. I mean, the economics are going to be very attractive in terms of fuel, and especially if oil prices rise as dramatically as we think they might. Is that 5 minutes? How do we get from here to there? If you follow the legislation on the Hill, you would think cap and trade is the way we restructure the energy economy. Unfortunately, it's probably not going to work that well. If you look at the cap and trade initiative as it now exists in the legislation, it doesn't look like it's going to have much effect on carbon emissions, as it has not in Europe for the last 4 years. If you were to take a poll of economists and ask them whether we should have cap and trade or tax restructuring, probably 95% would say tax restructuring. By that we mean lowering income taxes and raising the carbon tax. We don't change the amount we pay. We just take one down and take the other one up over, say, the next decade or so. That would lead to a rapid restructuring of the energy economy in and of itself. When I think about these issues and how we can change quickly, I use sort of 3 models of social change to think about things. One I call the Pearl Harbor model, where you have a catastrophic event that changes everything. With climate change, if we reach that point, it might be too late. The second model I call the Berlin Wall model, where you have something gradually rising, till finally it hits a tipping point and everything changes. The Berlin Wall coming down was the physical manifestation of a political revolution in Eastern Europe that changed the form of government in every country. And it was essentially a bloodless political revolution. The third model I call the sandwich model, where you have an upwelling of support for change from the grassroots and a responsive leadership at the top. When you get that, you can often get very rapid change. I think that's what we may now have in this country. When I get a little discouraged about how enormous an effort it's going to take, I go back and reread the economic history of World War II. It begins with December 7th, 1941, surprise attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. They managed to sink a good part of our Pacific fleet that was at anchor in Pearl Harbor. Then a month later, January 6, 1942, President Roosevelt gave the State of the Union address in which he announced our arms production goals. I mean, we were totally in World War II at that point. He said, we're going to produce 45,000 tanks, 60,000 planes, 20,000 artillery guns, and thousands of ships. No one had ever seen arms production numbers like that anywhere in the world. These were off the chart. But what Roosevelt and his colleagues realized was that at that time, the largest concentration of industrial power in the world was in the U.S. automobile industry. So after his State of the Union address, he called in the leaders of the industry and said, because you guys represent such a large share of our industrial capacity, remember, we were making 2 or 3 million cars a year during the Depression. He said, because you represent such a large share of our industrial capacity, we're going to rely heavily on you to help us reach these production goals, these arms production goals. And they said, well, Mr. President, we're going to do everything we can, but it's going to be a stretch producing cars and all these arms too. He said, you don't understand. We're going to ban the sale of private automobiles in the United States. And that's exactly what happened. From the beginning of April 1942 until the end of 1944, there were essentially no cars produced in the United States, and we exceeded every one of those arms production goals. We produced not 60,000 planes, but 229,000 planes. Fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, troop transports, cargo transports. It's extraordinary. I was in Seattle last Friday, and this is airplane country. And the idea of producing 229,000 planes is even today intimidating. But the importance of this example is that it did not take decades to restructure the U.S. industrial economy. It didn't take years. We did it in a matter of months. And if we could do that then we can restructure the energy economy today if it becomes important enough for us to do so. We, as environmental, we're in a race between tipping points, between natural tipping points and political tipping points. Ice melting versus closing coal-fired power plants, for example. As environmentalists, we've been talking about saving the planet for decades now. But as I think about it, I think the planet's going to be around for a long time to come. The question is, can we save civilization itself as the stresses mount and as the weaker governments begin to break down, and then even some of the stronger governments begin to break down? That's the challenge. And it's not a spectator sport. Someone was asking me before the meeting, what can we do? And they expect me to say, well, change your light bulbs and recycle your newspapers and so forth. Those are important, but we now have to become politically active. We need to change the system. I don't mean a political revolution. I mean we need to restructure the economy so that we can sustain progress, so we can sustain civilization. And it's not a spectator sport. We have to get involved. Pick an issue that's important to you. Closing coal-fired power plants in Illinois. Developing a world-class recycling program, because the energy savings inherent in that are huge. Or join a population group that's working to stabilize world population. Or go to work on bottled water. This is one of the most obscene uses of energy and resources in the world, particularly when you realize that the standards for public water in almost every state in this country are higher than they are for bottled water. It's a con job of epic proportions, but it takes a lot of energy. It's not just the oil to produce the plastic for the bottles, but it's the energy it takes to move water, to haul water around when we have pipes that move it very efficiently. That's why bottled water costs 1,000 times as much as tap water, just because of the enormous amount of energy embodied in it. So get involved. Pick an issue, go to work, get some friends who share your concerns, and organize. Begin working with members of the city council or your representatives in Washington. You have a president from Illinois now. Great opportunity. So let's get involved. The stakes could not be higher. I think with that, we can go to questions.
If we attempt to electrify our auto transport network, there's going to have to be a lot of transmission to recharging centers. What kind of research has been done on lowering the amount of waste heat through electrical transmission lines?
One of the best studies that's available is one that's been done by the Northwest Labs, located in the state of Washington. And what they did, and this request to them came from Senator Maria Cantwell, what they did was look at the U.S. generating capacity, and they asked the question, could we run our cars on this system? And what they pointed out was, because most of the recharging would be done at night, that we could convert 70% of our fleet to electric cars and have enough electricity to operate them. 70%. We couldn't do the whole fleet quite. We'd have to make some modifications. But your point about electricity transmission efficiency is well taken, because one of the things we need to do is to develop a national grid in the same way that in the 1950s we needed an interstate highway system. We had all these state systems, and sometimes they connected pretty well, but they weren't designed to permit longer distance travel. So we did the interstate highway system. What we now know is that high voltage transmission lines using DC, direct current, are highly efficient in transmitting electricity long distance, and by that I mean hundreds and hundreds of miles. There is now a proposal, interestingly. As you may know, the country has sort of a western grid and an eastern grid where they're more or less tied together, and a Texas grid. Texas has its own grid. And there is a proposal that's getting favorable consideration from FERC, the Federal Electrical Regulatory Commission, to link those three grids in a huge center with transmission lines near Clovis, New Mexico, which is sort of very close to where the three grids all come together. So there is work underway, and there are individual pieces of this now well along, whether it's linking wind farms in western Wyoming or southern Montana with California, or linking the Dakotas, the wind in the Dakotas, for example, to Chicago and the industrial heartland. So a lot of these are well along in the planning stages, but it's one of the keys to having a highly efficient economy running largely on electricity. Yes, sir.
It seems to me we've deforested land and drained lands. On the Army Corps of Engineers site, it says all our most fertile croplands are drained, deforested wetlands. Have you done any projections as to how long our agricultural soils will last?
It depends a lot on where we're looking. I don't know if by our you mean the world or the U.S.
Well, ours, I don't know what's going on elsewhere, but I've heard in countries like Ethiopia, first they had 100 years ago forests, and they had fertile lands. First they deforested, then they used up all the soil. And what I've realized recently is our farmland is an ecological desert. It's a monoculture that's chemicalized, and the lands have been deforested, so leaves and insects and animals and birds all made the soil, so there's nothing left to recreate the soil. We've killed the animals. Now the USDA has a wing called aphis that is poisoning tens of millions of birds. So to my mind, there's nothing to recreate that soil, and that's crucial to food and everything. I'm just wondering if you've studied that. How are we going to get soil to grow anything? Like,
we happen to be richly endowed with soils, as Ethiopia once was. And there are two things that affect soil fertility. One is the nutrient content of the soil, and the second is the structure of the soil. Soil scientists call it the tilth, if you will. We are losing quite a bit of topsoil to erosion here in the Midwest, particularly where we have rolling farmland, as in Iowa. Currently, we have one of the finest pieces of agricultural real estate in the world, but we're slowly losing some of it. Just to give you a sense of how productive our land is, Iowa, for example, produces more grain than Canada. And that's kind of surprising when you first hear it, but that happens to be the reality. And the question you're raising is, can we protect the productivity of these soils indefinitely, because we're going to need more and more food?
Or renew them, because what I was hearing is that those soils are drained, deforested wetlands. So each time we take a crop off, even though there's erosion, we're taking material from the soil. Eventually, that soil is going to be diminished, and there's not going to be anything left there to grow anything with, because the crops are made of atoms and molecules from the soil.
Yeah. What we're losing is nutrients, and what we're putting back now is nutrients. I mean, we have broken the natural nutrient cycle by moving to cities, for example. So we take crops from rural areas and consume them in cities, and they end up in sewage systems. Those nutrients do not get back on the land. And it's even more true of international trade, where we export close to 100 million tons of grain a year. So we export 2 or 3 million tons of plant nutrients like phosphates and nitrates and potassium and potash and so forth. And the only way we can get that back now is to put it back in chemical form. We can't retrieve it, from the Nile River or Tokyo Bay or wherever these nutrients end up. So it's it's a basic challenge we have in disrupting the nutrient cycle.
Thank you.
Hi. You make a strong case that there are technological solutions available that can mitigate a lot of these worst problems, but the larger problem seems to be getting policymakers to put a real push behind these solutions, convincing them that we are talking about a threat to modern civilization, convincing them that this is not something that can be put off. Right. What troubles me about your World War II analogy is that after Pearl Harbor, there was a clear, undeniable crisis that trumped ordinary political divisions. Right now, we don't have that, and when environmental change reaches a tipping point that is so devastating and undeniable that it's the equivalent of a Pearl Harbor, we may well be at a point where these sorts of solutions no longer are as effective.
Right.
What do you see as the most effective way to actually light a fire under policymakers and to get them to take a look at these longer-term issues that right now don't necessarily affect their next election cycle?
Right. It depends on you and me becoming politically active. And let me give you a recent national example. Over the last 2 years, there has emerged a powerful grassroots movement to ban the construction of new coal-fired power plants. And it's been remarkably successful. Sierra Club has been coordinating. Earth justice lawyers have been handling the court challenges, of which there are scores and scores. But it has been effective. And it may be that we'll not see many, if any, new coal-fired power plants licensed in this country. It's a major achievement. I don't think most people yet have realized it. I mean, just to give you an example, over the last 2 years, coal consumption in this country has dropped by 11%. Now, part of that was the recession, but part of it is coal being replaced by more efficient use or being backed out by wind. Even during this recession, during the last 2 years, we've brought 190 wind farms online in this country with over 15,000 megawatts of generating capacity. Beyond that, there are 22 additional coal-fired power plants scheduled for closing now, either to be replaced by efficiency gains, they don't need them anymore, or to be replaced by wind or natural gas or wood chips or something else. So things are happening, and it's happening because people have become active. The number of activists is not numbered in the millions in this area. It's numbered in the thousands, but it's a very effective group, and it's coordinated with information and ideas from Sierra, which is working at the national level. That's the kind of change we need, and it's happened quite independently of Congress. Congress hasn't passed any legislation banning new coal-fired power plants, but this grassroots movement has brought the coal industry to a standstill. It's not unlike what happened to the tobacco industry, a dozen years ago. Yes?
There's skepticism that if the United States does not pass this climate change legislation before the Copenhagen Conference, which is seeming very unlikely due to the healthcare debate, among other reasons, there's skepticism that if this legislation is not passed in time for Copenhagen, that really nothing of any substance will be produced at Copenhagen. If this happens, where does the international community go from there?
I would first say that internationally negotiated climate agreements may have become obsolete, but we have not yet realized it. And I say that for two reasons. One, by their nature, these agreements are minimalist because no country wants to appear to have done more than anyone else. And the people who go to these are diplomats and lawyers. They're not scientists and people with imagination and so forth. And any former Foreign Service officers here? So Kyoto, we got 7% over, 15 years or something for the industrial countries to cut carbon emissions. But if we reach an agreement next year, I don't think we're going to reach one in Copenhagen. If we reach it next year, it'll then take years to get enough countries to ratify it for it to take effect. The game may be over by then. I mean, we've been working on Copenhagen for years now, and it looks like we're not going to make it. So I think both because of time and because of the minimalist nature, these are probably, I would not count on internationally negotiated climate agreements to stabilize world climate and save civilization. I think it's going to happen very differently. I mentioned the movement opposing coal-fired power plants. At no point did the leaders of this movement say, we want to do this if Europe does it, if China does it, if the rest of the world does it. They just said, we want to ban new coal-fired power plants in this country. Or if you look at that consortium in Europe with a dozen companies wanting to build all the solar thermal power plants in North Africa, there's not a single government agency in that group of a dozen. They're all private companies. So things are happening independently of governments and internationally negotiated climate agreements.
You mentioned the project for North Africa to harness solar power and then to send it to Europe and such. What's there to prevent solar power from going the same way of something like natural gas? Is solar power also vulnerable to the resource curse that often afflicts less developed countries?
Well, first let me say that I was generalizing with summaries, but a good part of that solar thermal power will also be used in North Africa. And the exports of electricity from a country like Algeria will be like exports of oil today. I mean, Algeria wants to export energy and it knows it can't export oil. So I think if your question is what are the chances of it being disrupted, I mean, it is possible. But there will not be just one cable underlying. No.
No, it's the whole problem of corruption and stuff like that.
Oh.
Like the resource curse. Like
right.
Well, in Algeria, it's natural gas. In Nigeria, it's oil. Mm-hmm. The whole problem of corruption
right.
coming up and that sort of thing.
That's a major problem. One of the differences here is that the electricity produced will be consumed locally as well as exported. So there will be a stake in developing it, and we have to hope that it'll be done in a way that will benefit the populations at large, not just a small group, as has been the case with oil in Nigeria, for example.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful talk. It's been just really educational. I've been hearing recently about what seems to be the growing unreliability of our forecasts of future oil production. And it seems that we may have reached a tipping point in terms of realizing that there's just not as much oil out there as people would like to think there is. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what impacts this might have politically, and if it's maybe a starting point that we can tap into in terms of affecting political change.
Mm-hmm. I've spent some time trying to analyze the world oil situation, trying to see when production will peak. My guess is that we're never going to produce much more oil than we now are. And it may well be that it peaked a year or two ago and is on the way down. Now, the interesting thing is that we have all spent our lifetimes in a world where oil production was rising. A world where oil production is declining will be a very different world. And this is why I am so eager to get this country converted to electricity, for example, to run our cars instead of being dependent on oil. And it doesn't have to disrupt the economic system if we play it right. I mean, we've made energy transitions before. We went from wood to coal, and then oil became the major player, and this is simply going beyond that. The exciting thing is we have the technologies now. We can see how to build a new economy that's not dependent on oil. And I think that's exciting. It's not as though what are we going to do now? We know what to do, and we're starting to do it.
What do you find most personally satisfying in your work of surveying environmental problems and solutions?
Thank you.
I know it's a bit of a challenge at times. That's why I ask.
Yeah. I've sort of reached this point in career, I suppose, where I'm often asked, these sorts of questions. Someone asked me what was my biggest mistake, and that's actually easier. That came about, I think it was early 1997. I was heading the World Watch Institute then, and the environment minister from Germany was coming to Washington, and her office had called ahead and asked if I would be available for a meeting. And I said I'd be happy to meet with her. And so one afternoon, I don't know, it was 4:30 or 5 o'clock, went over to the Watergate Hotel where she was staying. And we had a meeting for, at least an hour and a half, maybe longer than that, just a very informal, free-flowing discussion of global environmental issues and exchanging ideas and so forth. And a couple weeks later, I got a letter from her suggesting that maybe we could co-author a book together on global environmental issues. But I was doing State of the World and another annual called Vital Signs, and still another book I was working on. The idea of a fourth book I knew would just push me over the edge. So I wrote back and politely declined. But now that Angela Merkel is Chancellor of Germany, I thought maybe I would get that letter out, and say, remember that idea you had? I mean, I could have been famous. But I console myself with the thought that if indeed we had done a book together, she might not be Chancellor of Germany today. Because anything I would have been happy with would have been much too liberal for her Conservative Party base in Germany. I think as a researcher, the things I find most satisfying is because I have some training in the natural sciences and social sciences, because I do an enormous amount of reading. And my staff just gives me this many clips every day of science journals and newspapers and things to read. And it's being able to see how things connect and the relationship between them, because unfortunately our world, whether it's government departments or university departments, there's a tendency to sort of squish things down into a fairly narrow lens. And the challenge is to see how things fit together and to realize that future food security, for example, will be determined as much by energy ministers as by agriculture ministers. That the role of family planning of family planners will be as important as that of farmers in achieving a sustainable balance and going through that. I remember when I was launching the Chinese edition of Plan B 3.0 in Beijing last year, I suggested to a group of government officials, somewhat facetiously, that they build a phone line from the Ministry of Agriculture to the Ministry of Energy so that they could talk with each other, because the decisions being made in the Ministry of Energy were going to have a far greater effect on future food security than those made in the Ministry of Agriculture. And in fact, they've begun to do that, not to build the phone line, but to seriously engage the question of how they can restructure their energy economy. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Sarah Warren. I'm a psychologist working on climate change. And I like your sandwich analogy. Mm-hmm. Part of what I'm thinking about is who is the most important audience to reach at this point and in what way. And in spite of my University of Chicago postdoc, I'm targeting most of my efforts towards the mass market, developing an entertainment radio show that's got a green focus. And I'm just wondering where you think we are in terms of that, the bottom piece of bread in the sandwich, and what percentage of the population needs to become part of that sandwich, and in addition to the message of political engagement, with which I totally agree, what is the message we need to be giving? Mm-hmm.
What I've come to realize is that, we think about getting climate legislation through Congress, we think of a majority, maybe even more than 60% if it involves a potential Senate filibuster. But some of the most important things happening don't even involve Congress. I mentioned the sort of de facto moratorium we now have on new coal plants. It's an extraordinary achievement. And it happened because there were handfuls of people all across the country who are just saying enough. We don't want more of these coal plants with all the local pollution and with their effect on climate. We're thinking about our children and grandchildren, and this is not part of what we want to see. So sometimes a small group can organize and bring about change in a way that that is surprising, but also encouraging. Mm-hmm. And the media is, doing a better job now. But you look at cable TV and you look at all these reality shows and so forth. They want to have real reality shows, to see what's happening with climate change and how it's affecting people around the world. That would be a reality show worth watching. And that's why I'm sort of excited by the idea of having a 2-hour special on Plan B.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Final question.
Hi. I was just curious. I know people don't really like to talk about winners from climate change, but your discussion on grain got me thinking about, I heard a lot about Russia being one of the winners from climate change because they'll have a lot of extra grain they could grow, and there are other countries, and I was wondering if you can discuss that for a second.
Mm-hmm. In a sense, there will be winners, but it's probably a very short-term sort of thing. I mean, if civilization is disintegrating, there won't be any winners. We're either going to all make it together, or we're all going to go down together. And I have people tell me, I gave a talk in Boston, someone said, well, I live in New Hampshire, back in the mountains, and we've got solar cells, and we have our own water supply, our own well, and we have a few acres on which to grow our own food, so we don't have to worry. What they don't realize is that when civilization begins to break down, no one is secure. And we're all in this together, and that's the basic point that I would want to make, though there may be short-term gains here and there. Let me close with a final story, if I might, because we are at closing time. Some of you will remember the name Will Durant. He married a graduate student. Her name was Ariel, and they wrote a 13-volume thing on world history. This was more than half a century ago, so not everyone here will remember it. Will Durant also had the distinction of having his doctoral dissertation published as a book by McGraw-Hill. But a couple years after it was published, McGraw-Hill contacted him and said they had 900 copies of the book left. It was no longer selling. They were going to remainder the books unless he would like them. And he wrote back and said he would like them. And so he and Ariel had a new home, and he had a study lined with bookshelves. He had about 100 books of his own, but they had all this empty space. So they drove up to the McGraw-Hill warehouse in northern New Jersey, not that far from where they're living, brought all the books home and filled his study with the books. And sometime later, he was writing a friend in Europe. And he said, Ariel and I are settled down housekeeping. We're enjoying life very much and so forth. He said, no, by the way, he said, in my study, I now have a library of 1,000 books, 900 of which I've written myself. Now, lest I end up with such a library, the books will be on sale out there, and I will be signing them up here. Thank you very much.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. The World Beyond the Headlines series aims to bring scholars and journalists together to consider international news stories and how these stories are covered. As a listener, you have come to rely on this program for in-depth analysis of major issues facing our country and our world. But we can only continue our nationally recognized coverage with support from you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and from generous contributions from listeners like you.